get through this.
Easy for listening. I was able to do it.
Easy for dancing. I'm not a great lover of cats.
That's my fear.
You're a disgrace, you are.
Not me.
That's my fear.
You're a disgrace, you are.
Hello and welcome to One-on-One Shadowboxing. Today my guest is Mark Newhouse, who is the chairperson of...
the Deaths in Custody Watch Committee of Western Australia.
Mark, how do you get into that position?
My first, I guess, contact with this area was in apartheid South Africa, which is where I'm from originally. And I was involved in an organisation called the South African Prisoners Organisation for Human Rights, and that would have been in the early 90s.
I think the average punters at home watching this program thinks, you know, when you are in prison and you are punished by law of our wonderful society, then you not have any rights for anything.
The key issue is that with imprisonment, that in and of itself is the punishment or penalty. That does not then should not translate into that because you are a prisoner of the state, that you somehow your human rights are ignored or they don't exist. That's not the case. So the fact that someone is in prison means that they still have a range of human rights which need to be upheld under international law.
Can you list all of those basic human rights which belong to the even
sure.
the people in prison?
I mean, there's a range, but you know, the right to not be tortured or experience any other trauma is one of those. And Australia is a signatory to the Convention on the Prevention of Torture and other degrading treatment. There's the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. The list is extensive. As well as the right to vote. So, for example...
So if you are in prison, you still got the right to vote? By convention?
Absolutely. And, but the reality is that in this country and other countries that in Australia, if your sentence is less than 3 years, you are entitled to vote. If it's longer than 3 years, you're not entitled to vote.
So what makes them discriminate between the 6 years or 3 years or 3.5 years?
Who knows?
That's a very strange...
I suspect it's that if you've got a longer sentence, that it's considered that you're
more criminal.
Yeah, and you're not fit to
exercise your rights.
Your right to vote. And that's essentially how I got involved with this in South Africa, because people wanted to vote in the first democratic elections
in South Africa.
In South Africa,
yes,
and they did, and those rights are reflected in the Constitution.
That's in custody. It's a very serious issue. What is the ratio in Australia of the prison population and the deaths in that population? I mean, you know, aggravated deaths.
Well, look, what we know is that based on a recent report by the Australian Institute of Criminology, that has the role of recording and collecting the data and producing reports and monitoring any death in custody, that over the last 5 years there has been a significant increase in the number of Aboriginal people dying in prison, and there is a direct correlation between that and an almost doubling of the number of Aboriginal people being imprisoned around the country. The Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, essentially one of the things that it found was that the obvious way to reduce Aboriginal deaths in custody is to reduce the number of Aboriginal people in prison and who come into contact with the criminal justice system. Our view is that, and many others, is that if some of the key recommendations of the Royal Commission had been taken seriously and implemented fully, that we would have seen a huge, we wouldn't be in the situation that we are in today. So, for example, the recommendation 87A talks about that all police services should adopt and apply the principle of arrest as the last resort. And
that's really not what's happening on the streets.
no, clearly isn't happening.
Anything and everything, any movement, the police thinks suspicious, arrest, arrest, arrest. Not just Aboriginals.
No. However, it's very clear, and there's the evidence to support it, that racialised punishment in Australia since colonisation, that there's an unbroken line in racialised punishment. So the question of race, class, gender, and so on are critical to understanding how and whose interests the criminal justice system serves. A number of other recommendations, so that was recommendation 87. The other one is that basically governments, state and territory governments that haven't passed laws that police services and corrective, prisons,
Yes.
that they have a duty of care for the people that are in their care. The other one is obviously that prison be used as a last resort. Our view is if those recommendations had been implemented, we simply would not be in the current situation that we're in.
So the Royal Commission's naive suggestions, looking at it from today's point of view, not just not implemented, but the whole situation is in general went worse for everyone facing with the law in here and facing with policy in Australia. So what's the hope your organization has got to change the tide when the tide is already turned not to the right direction but to probably the worst direction?
Oh look, undoubtedly our organisation has been around since '93, and to say that there has been no useful changes would be incorrect. There has been, but on the flip side of that, the situation has got a lot worse to the point where it is an international disgrace, really. When we look at the rate at which we imprison, in particular, Aboriginal people, and often the conditions in which they're kept, particularly in regional areas, is not the same as, say, in the metropolitan areas. Those prisons, some of them are just horrific.
So tell me something about your organization, Mark. Where the finance is coming from and how do you keep the daily activities alive?
Sure. Basically, it was formed following the Royal Commission, and there was a call to establish Aboriginal deaths in custody committees around the country, and that occurred. In Western Australia, the founding members made a conscious decision to call it the Deaths in Custody Watch Committee because they were of the view that whilst the issue is one which disproportionately affects Aboriginal people, that there is also concern for other population groups in prisons and police lockups. And that's, well acknowledged by many Aboriginal people as well. And it was essentially set up to monitor the implementation of the recommendations.
Who set it up?
It was set up by a number of people, including the late Sir Ronald Wilson was one of the founding members, through to Judge Hal Jackson. There were trade unions involved, church groups, the late Jack Davis, Nongai elders. So it was set up by a fairly prominent group of people at the time, and a woman called Kath Mallett, who was the executive officer. And so at that time it was funded through a range of different funding sources, but the main one being the federal government. And probably in about 2000 or about 2003, when there was a change in the federal government, we received notification that we were no longer going to be funded. So the question was...
Because all the debts in custody disappeared. What was the basis of no funding?
We have no idea.
I thought the problem being solved. That's why if you set up something, you set up with a good intention to solve the problem and monitor it, of course, and reduce it to the minimum. Then you say, okay, guys, you've done what you need to.
Yeah, well, it would be nice to wake up and know that there's no longer a need for such a organisation, but that's not the case. So we had to make a decision about whether we continued unfunded, from having staff and so on, or to wind it down. And the decision of the membership at the time was to continue, and so we had to change the focus of how we approach things. So moving from a funded organisation to an unfunded one, we decided that we would essentially become more of a campaign organisation and to continue the work but in a different way.
On that note, Mark, we have to go to a short break, but please stay with us, because after the break we're coming back to discuss the debt in custody issue in Australia with Mark.